We do have a short time together in rather a large group, so we'll be sure to save some time at the end of the presentation to review any of your questions or comments. There'll also be an evaluation, a presenter evaluation form that'll be circulated around via email once this is completed. So please be sure to complete that as well and give some valuable feedback for our presenters today. We're incredibly fortunate to have with us Dr. Curtis Davis and Dr. Samantha Francois to share their work. So I'm going to just sort of briefly introduce you all to them, and then I'll turn it over to them to get started. Again, I know we still have folks who are joining, but they'll catch up with us as we go. So to start, Dr. Davis is an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Southern Mississippi. He's also a Tulane alum from our PhD program in social work. And his work examines how racism-based trauma is conceptualized, assessed, and treated through social work intervention. So welcome, Dr. Davis. Thanks for being with us today. And Dr. Francois is an assistant professor and the Sonia Belger-Romanowski early career professor at the Tulane School of Social Work. Dr. Francois' research uses systems perspectives to understand the intersection of individual and community. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Davis and Dr. Francois. Thank you both for being with us today.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Great, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm about to share my screen, but before I do that, I want to send well wishes to all of you. Hope that you're doing well, hope that you are safe and healthy and in good spirits. And I appreciate you taking some time out of your afternoon to spend some time with us and to hear from us. So with that being said, I will begin to share this. Perfect. So welcome to the Lifting the Veil presentation. Today, Dr. Francois and I are going to spend some time talking about the concept or the construct known as racism-based trauma and how we as social workers and community members and practitioners and educators consider in our practice and our advocacy and in our research. I wanted to go ahead and get started by sort of explaining this lifting the veil concept or where that comes from. That comes from W.B. Du Bois and his concept, which suggests that the veil is a literal separation between two groups of people, primarily Black and white people. And one of the biggest concepts in that is that white people lack certain levels of clarity to see Blacks as Americans or as humans. Throughout the presentation, we'll spend some time talking about how participants from this research have defined racism-based trauma. But beyond that, we're gonna spend some time just hearing from their insights and seeing how we can sort of incorporate some sensitivity to this construct in our daily lives. I will say that throughout the presentation, it's rooted in qualitative research. So the data is coming from interviews, but there's also components of another study that I'm doing. It's a discourse analysis or content analysis where you'll see some images, primarily from social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I will say that I don't think that any of the images should cause any duress, but I wanted to add it because they are, one, going to amplify voices, particularly Black voices, in the content that they're putting out there during a movement, specifically the Black Lives Matter movement. It's also a way to break up the monotony and appeal to different learning styles. And you also get a chance to see how you can be creative when you think about and when you consider this idea of racism-based trauma. So what I want to do is move forward and just offer this up before we dive into the concept or before we dive into the PowerPoint. I'm seeing the number of participants. I don't know who all is watching, but I do want to be considerate of the fact that we all are trying to understand race and racism, particularly in America. We all have to start somewhere. There are things that we know and there are things that we don't know. I'm including this image of some clothing. You may recognize the brand, you may not. This is the symbol for Brooks Brothers. It's a popular clothing line here in the country. They just, I think, filed for bankruptcy. The clothing line is a popular one that's been worn by former presidents like Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, even down to President Barack Obama. What I think that is interesting about this clothing line, and one that I didn't know, is that during slavery, this clothing line and the manufacturers, primarily the Brooks Brothers, supplied their clothing to slave owners and plantation owners, and used the clothing to dress slaves up and make them look more presentable when they went to slave markets. So more particularly for my New Orleans people, this is something that slaves would use when they would go down to Esplanade Avenue and wear the clothes. I used to wear Brooks Brothers. I don't wear it anymore, but I include this to sort of get us oriented to this concept and to say that, hey, this is important for us to pay attention to and to really give ourselves some grace as we engage with the idea of race and racism and figure out where we fall in understanding it. I don't want anyone to shy away from it, and I think I can speak for Dr. Francois as well. We want you to be participants and consider this phenomenon. And in the words of a good colleague of mine, Sienna Abdullah, she taught me a long time ago that it's important to call people in instead of calling people out. And I think that that's the approach that I'll be taking with this and that we'll be taking with this. So when we think about race and racism in the country, a good way to start is to figure out where your passion is and figure out where you fall in thinking about this idea of race, your racial identity, and the experiences of other people. A brief anecdote about where this started for me. I am a social work practitioner and I'm in the academy. A term that I've heard used and I think some colleagues use is called being a pracademic. We believe in community engagement and taking what we learn in the classroom and in research and applying that to the field and making sure that our findings as researchers are digestible and translational to our clients. So this is a former client of mine named Mr. John Doe. Mr. John Doe, when I was working at the Federal Public Defender's Office somewhere in the country, he was one of the last clients that I had. Mr. John Doe, you can see that he was charged with various offenses, but he had a vacated sentence. There were some technicalities in how he was sentenced, and he was supposed to be released early. When he was scheduled to be released early, this brought on a lot of different stress and a lot of different panics. And he also would not work with anyone in the office other than me. Granted, we share the same race, we shared similar skin tones, and it was assumed that we would be able to connect because we were both Black and because we were both Black men. Mr. John Doe, what I failed to realize when working with him and building rapport and doing my biopsychosocial assessments is that his ability to function and reintegrate into society and think highly of himself was really tied to his racial identity, which is what we'll talk about, and his upbringing and his identity as being a Black man. He's from a city where it's a staple, quote unquote, in regards to the civil rights movement. And that is tied closely to his identity. And when I was working with him, I completely ignored that. I had no idea that he had sort of been stressed out by racialized systems to the point where he would sweat, he would become angry, he would shut down, he wouldn't talk to myself or his legal team. Mr. Doe is doing okay now, but as a pracademic or as an academic, one thing that I realized and how he lit the fire in my belly was realizing that he had been a victim, or he had been suffering from this idea of what we now know or recognize as race-based traumatic stress injury. I want to offer a simple term, and then in a second, Dr. Francois and I are going to talk about how this term may differ from racism-based trauma. So this term, it's been used throughout the literature, and it's being used currently. And just for us to sort of get us acclimated to it, race-based traumatic stress injury is a reaction in which a multitude of symptoms, signs, and injuries follow one or more experiences of a racially oppressive situation, whether done overtly or covertly. This is coined by Dr. Robert Carter out of Columbia, and it is something that I really use to sort of spark my interest in this topic and really as it relates to social work. What I will say about his concept, when reading his literature, he started this by pairing it with the legal field and trying to figure out a way to legitimize the experiences of people in the workforce who experience racism and who were trying to get justice. So we want to say that with race-based traumatic stress injury, what this looks like is very similar to other traumatic experiences. So it starts with a racist event. That event is experienced during which stress is prompted. The injury of this event is something where it's sudden. Dr. Carter says it's negative. Dr. Carter says it's uncontrollable. Once we get into the research and the interviews that I did with social workers, we'll find out how they feel about the construct and how the definition that we came up with varies from this a little bit. There are critical signs of the injury. These vary. They can be visible. They can include avoidance, intrusion, or arousal. And then the signs are exhibited along with other strong indicators. And we'll get into that in a second. What I do want to do, in staying true to this presentation, to our research, and to the title, is spend a little time talking about the nuance and the differences between race-based trauma or racism-based trauma. And I think Dr. Francois is going to spend some time talking about that.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Davis. Good afternoon, everyone. In doing this work with Dr. Davis, it started to stand out to me in particular and become important for me to really think about the nomenclature for what we were talking about, what we were calling this thing, what the literature, how the literature had referred to this particular type of trauma. Dr. Davis in his previous slide referenced the really important work of Dr. Carter around race-based traumatic stress injury, which had very much in the context of that scholarship and that work been conceptualized as an individual level psychological phenomenon. So the individual experiences this racist event and has these particular outcomes in a very individual way. However, there's also what I came to think of as complementary constructs out there in the world of unpacking different types of trauma that are related to racism, specifically collective trauma and or cultural trauma. Both of which you will find, wealthy or healthy literatures on collective trauma and cultural trauma. And these two types of trauma really talk about a traumatic event or traumatic experience that is experienced at the level of a society, a community, or a group. So that collective society, community, or group determines they determine that particular experience or event is a traumatic one to the collective. And so I thought it was important to really think about, in the context of race-based traumatic stress injury and what had been being called race-based trauma, which was very individual level focused, and thinking specifically about the experiences with racism of African Americans, so people of African descent in the Americas who came to the Americas, many of whom came to the Americas via the transatlantic slave trade, that yes, there are individual level events and incidents that are traumatic, that occurred, but there's also this collective group level trauma that is experienced or has been experienced by that group in particular. And that's certainly not the only group that has collective or cultural trauma that we can speak to, but that was a particular group of or population of focus in my work and the ways in which my work complemented Dr. Davis's work. So I really push for us to really shape our thinking around this type of trauma as racism-based trauma, meaning the trauma is situated in these various forms that racism take, not just in this country, but certainly globally. So acknowledging that experiences of racism can happen in a systematic way, in a cultural way, and in an interpersonal way. So those systematic or structural or institutional. Many of us may be familiar with those terms as well. So those types of racism, cultural racism, are those types of racisms or racist events or experiences of racism tend to be those that happen at the level of a society or at the level of a collective. And racism-based trauma and how we're advancing this as a concept, we're arguing that it definitely has elements of both a collective element as well as an individual level element. So it is both one and the same. Racism-based trauma is both one and the same, a collective or cultural experience of racism as well as an individual psychological experience of racism because of the different forms in which marginalized, minoritized, oppressed populations experience racism.
Definitely. I can say that I appreciate Dr. Francois' explanation of that. And it's helped me learn not only about the construct, but it's helped me in how I educate and talk about this. It is layered, it is nuanced. And I think that it's important that we acknowledge that. And I think too, it's important that we actually sort of call out the pervasiveness of racism, but to also say that, hey, this is caused by, again, a particular act or acts. I jumped ahead a little bit while Dr. Francois was speaking to sort of use this as a means to just sort of orient everyone to racially oppressive situations of what this looks like. When we are thinking about race and racism, we are thinking about, even though the term micro suggests that it may be insignificant, microaggressions aren't so micro, but we are thinking about various forms of racism. And we won't get into this today, but there are quite a few that I'm encouraging everyone to sort of consider as we move forward. So there are micro insults, micro assaults, micro invalidations, racial discrimination, harassment, and discriminatory harassment are all different things in different categories. And part of engaging with this construct is being familiar with it and knowing how to identify it. And also too, I just want to point out that throughout the presentation, you will see some graphics. And again, I want to reiterate, this is included because part of this includes or involves a content or discourse analysis, but it's also important to amplify Black voices. So most of the content that you'll see are from Black content creators and researchers and activists. So part of what we're going to do today is talk about how social workers in particular define racism-based trauma. I'll say that this is sort of couched in forensic social work or justice system social work. So the participants who provide their narratives all work in justice system settings. We're going to talk about the extent to which social workers engage with the construct in their practice and in education. And we're also going to talk about some of the benefits and challenges to thinking about this. I understand that this presentation also is not intended to be a one-off. It's probably going to take time to learn, and it's okay to revisit this, but this also serves as sort of a baseline as we move forward and think about how this construct relates to social work and social work practitioners, and then in the community and in the workplace as well. So a couple of things I want to highlight. This study is couched and it uses two theoretical lenses. One of the lenses is critical race theory. Because we're focusing on forensic social work in the justice system, it was important for us to consider revisionist history and interest convergence and structural determinism. And as you see, these themes allow us to consider the covert and overt subjugation of certain groups of people through different mechanisms. These could be the justice system, education system, the military, and how media frames certain things. There are also going to be images throughout this. So I included this one, and I think some people may be watching this from the phone, so it may be hard to see. This is a graphic from Kamal Bell, and he said that always remember that police bought Dylan Roof some Burger King after he murdered 9 Black people. George Floyd was accused of forgery. So as we think about racism-based trauma and the systems at play, it's important to consider. It was important for us to use this theory, and I know in my research and Dr. Francois' research, we use it pretty often. Dr. Francois, do you want to talk about the identity? Okay, great.
Yes, so along with sort of the guiding frameworks for this work and the questions we were aiming to answer with this work, in addition to that critical race theory, identity development theory was also another important guiding framework. So our intent here, so I'm not going to sort of talk through and give an instruction or teach you all of the different stages of identity development. What you see in front of you is one theory of identity development among people of color. There's another on the next slide. You'll see, and Dr. Davis, if you could click to the next slide, there's also identity development theories, particularly to white people. And they definitely have important differences, but what they have in common is that both theories, as well as kind of the theories that fall under identity development theories, often talk about people's identity development progressing from sort of this space of denial or non-recognition or non-acknowledgement of their identity as it relates to their racial group or ethnic group or national group, to eventually progressing to a stage where there is sort of this integrated and transformative sense of one's racial or ethnic identity. And depending on where one is in their identity development, that influences their experiences of racially charged or racist events or incidences. So depending on where one is in terms of their identity development, they may or may not experience a given incident or experience as being rooted in racism. So racism of any type, systemic, cultural, interpersonal. Whereas someone in a different stage may indeed. So there is what we're putting forth, or rather what we're offering up in terms of our guiding framework, is that one's conceptualization of racism-based trauma is also going to be situated in where they are in terms of their own racial identity development.
Most definitely. And these two theories are fluid. And like Dr. Francois mentioned, it would be worth some time to go and explore these and figure out where you are in your status, but to also figure out ways that you can incorporate this into your teachings or into your offices, or again, in your personal development. I include this picture because I think that it shows a good example of what identity development theory, how we can impact the different statuses, and also how the statuses are fluid. So it's quite possible that someone goes from this stage of contact where a person, particularly a white person, realizes, oh, there are groups of people who look differently than me, and there's this thing called race, and go into disintegration, where it's like, hey, I realize it, but I don't want to focus on anyone else at all. So I'm going to disintegrate from this idea. And then I may reorient myself into it, but things may become so overwhelming, or it may be such a shock to the system that I revert all the way back to disintegration or contact. This little girl is a family friend of mine. And what happened was, this particular day, I went to a church service with her and her family. And during the church service, she grabs my hand and takes me up to get communion. She had no issues with doing that, no shame or anything. And I'm realizing while I'm thinking about and doing this work that, hey, and her family is also really, 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 really involved in orienting her and educating her to racist systems and talking about race. So it's possible that you may have a child who jumps from contact and moves sort of to immersion or pseudo-independence sort of quickly. And it's possible that people can revert. Again, this is a fluid process, but I wanted to include it to sort of add a real life exemplar of what this looks like. So for the presentation and for the research, we're just going to be talking about how social workers in particular conceptualize racism-based trauma. We'll talk about the extent to which they engage with the intervention, and then talk about some interpersonal and intrapersonal engagements with the construct. It was important to think about how researchers or social workers felt in talking about racism-based trauma and how their coworkers or colleagues felt about it. But it was also important too because some of the participants were African Americans, African American women. So while doing the research and doing the interviews, what happened was that with some of them, not only did they not know that this construct existed, they were also dealing with sort of the reality that, hey, I might be experiencing racism-based trauma. And as a social worker or as a practitioner, as an interventionist, it's important to figure out where you are just as much as it is important to figure out where your clients are. So during the definition comes from codes or comes from themes that popped up during the interviews with the social workers. 3 of the themes that sort of form their conceptualization was that the experience happened unknowingly, was that it happened over a long period of time, and interesting enough, how it was based on location of where someone lived. So let's dive into it. When I asked some participants, particularly Sarah and Angela, both of them mentioned that defining racism-based trauma was something that they thought that their clients did not know or understand. Sarah's like, you watch Netflix, the most popular stuff is crime stuff. She's like, what in the world? It's like being at work. She said some of her clients aren't criminal masterminds like you may see on Netflix. She said they're confused and they ask why. They're like, I don't understand why I keep doing this. She mentioned there's a huge indication that some larger structures are going on. And to be clear, when I asked the participants to define racism-based trauma, none of them were able to define it. These were, and that's okay, these were social workers who had just graduated a year from when the study was done, and others, had graduated 5-10 years prior to when the study was done. So across the spectrum, and there were 14 participants total, none of them had thought about or engaged with this idea of racism-based trauma. Angela followed that up by saying, it's like a guy saying that they feel like they're being targeted everywhere they go in the neighborhood. She said it'd be helpful that they actually hear that, no, that actually happens. It's not you amplifying things. She was saying that she thinks racism-based trauma is having this sense of worry, this sense of uneasiness. It's like perceptive uneasiness when you walk through the world. Sarah, Monique, and Simone really teased out this idea that this experience was long-lasting. So Sarah just flat out said, I would describe it as generational or extremely traumatic. Monique said, I guess the first thing I would say is that it's ongoing trauma on the daily. Simone said, yeah, there are many ways to describe it. It's longitudinal, right? It's something that that can't be escaped or avoided or controlled by the individual who's experiencing it. And then to wrap up how they conceptualize the definition, Carmela, who worked in Alabama, said, I feel like certainly in the country, but definitely in Alabama, most of the clients that she works for have issues related to systemic racism. Eliza pointed to her experience in Philadelphia. She said it's complicated because a lot of the Black people who work in racialized systems are also Black, and they have to deal with that experience. And then Simone, who grew up all the way in Oregon, she said that Montana makes Oregon look diverse, and it's not. She said, let me tell you, one year at a Halloween party, the executive director, who was a social worker, came dressed as a Mexican. Like, what do you do with that? She asked. So in each of these sort of themes or concepts, I've used them, we've used them to sort of push forward an alternative definition to racism-based trauma in a way to explain it. I use this when I'm working with students or when I'm talking to people in the community. And the definition is that it's an often unbeknownst and persistently stressful reaction to a covert or overt racially oppressive situation, potentially accentuated by place or locale. So that's a mouthful, and I want to break that down. The unbeknownst part means that, yes, these experiences and this feeling of being traumatized happens oftentimes whether we realize it or not. Towards the end of the study, when talking to the participants, some of them said, hey, now I'm wondering if I have experienced racism-based trauma. That happens too a lot with older people that I talk to, so much so that one older person, a judge that I talked to one time, an African-American judge, was like, hey, I wonder if this has happened, and hey, how do I get reparations? I didn't have an answer, but this is what we're talking about, something that may happen over the course of the lifespan. It's persistent. So an anecdote or an example for me may be, even though I am a Black man and I hold a PhD, when I get pulled over, if and when I get pulled over by police, I roll down all my windows, I hang my arms out the window. I have a certain script that I follow when I get pulled over. This is this persistent stress that happens if and when I get pulled over. Blue lights frustrate me. So this is something that is pervasive and it affects people differently. And then covert or overt is just suggesting and holding on to this idea that not all racist acts have to be overt. As a graduate from the University of Mississippi, an overt act was when two students from Georgia hung a noose over a statue of the first African-American student. That's pretty overt. But it's also giving some attention and credence to these things that are covert, things that fly under the radar. And then social workers, and if we're engaging with this in practice, it's important to pay attention to that and figure out ways to tease it out. And then the last thing I'll say with this definition that's interesting is that it places emphasis on location or place. In a second, I'll talk about colorism and how colorism differs across the country and in different cities. But the way that the participants said, hey, it's a little bit different in Oregon, or it's a little bit different in New Orleans, was something that stood out. So moving forward, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what the participants said in terms of how they engage with this construct in their practice or in the classroom. It was pretty much the same across the board. There was minimal engagement. For instance, Megan said, that's a tough question. I feel like I struggle with resources on the daily. I feel like the programs that I was a part of didn't always take that into consideration. Eliza said sort of the same thing. The majority of our students were young white women who were 22 to 26. We had a lot of great students, but it was often a real challenge. We do role plays and say, how do you talk to about racism with your clients? But what does that look like? Just talking about race was not doing anything other than perpetuating this nonsense about colorblindness in the program. So we went a little bit further, and with some of the themes, the participants teased out that even though they weren't familiar with the construct or with racism-based trauma, they still did their best to figure out how to assess and respond to it. And they said that they would do it with consideration. And two things that they would do to start in their practice would be to validate and to educate. So for instance, Simone said, yeah, this is a pretty basic social work rule. Just acknowledge and validate. The first step is to learn to work on responding to someone who's experiencing it. Okay. Monique says, I think it's hard to respond. It's felt hard to respond, especially when they're disclosing to me, racial stress, such as the feeling of being targeted by police, but they're in jail. I feel kind of powerless. I think my way of responding is to just validate. So we're thinking about what that validation looks like and how when you leave from this presentation and you're thinking about, okay, how would I validate either my experiences? How would I make sure that I don't self-gaslight myself or gaslight someone else and validate their experiences? There are different things that you can do, but part of how you start is by sort of saying the names. If you follow the Black Lives Matter movement and watch the news, you hear chants of say her name, or you see that written. So for me today, when I'm educating or talking about this, I sort of encourage people to say the name, say his name, her name, their names, and to stop using things like everything that's going on when you talk about protests or, the current events or, the country situation. No, a lot of people like Khalil Green, for instance, is suggesting that you put a name to it. And you call it what it is. Anti-Black racism, lynchings, erasure, misogynoir, racist public health inequities. Again, adding a name to it furthers and validates that experiences. In a second, we'll talk about the difference between performative allyship and authentic allyship. And if we're committed to being authentic allies, it means validating the experiences of our coworkers, colleagues, family members, and especially clients and students, because we're thinking about higher education as well. So another part of this was about educating. Educating is the name of the game. This is why we're here in this particular setting. And Harriet's an African-American woman. She's been practicing, I think, for about 20 years. Harriet says, you know, I do know there's discrimination out there. I try to get our clients to see that. She's like, okay, if they're followed from their house to the bank and they were just going to withdraw some money and they get pulled over, she wants to talk about that. She wants to figure out a way to educate herself and her clients on the system as a whole. And I think with a lot of the participants, the validating and educating goes directly into sort of interventions. There's future research that we all have to do and to figure out if educating and validating could be some form of treatment. So again, she mentioned educating. Angela followed that up as well and said, I think the other thing that can be empowering because you can help support your client as they develop the language and awareness around their possibility and how they can navigate in these spaces. Racism-based trauma is something that's interesting because there are people or victims of racism-based trauma who can go out and experience the trauma on a daily basis. So figuring out ways to navigate that is really important. She said, I think that those of us who are socially conscious and aware make different choices and can be strategic. So we're strategizing. We can calculate, we can educate, we can advocate. So let's focus on some media and what this looks like and what you can do, I guess today or tomorrow when you're thinking about educating people in the workforce and in your classroom, and especially me with students. So Happy Danny, and this is great, she's suggesting, or this person is suggesting that you shift from this I don't see color mentality. This happens in social work a lot where there's this euphemism of, oh, I'm a social worker, therefore I can't be racist. We push back against that. There's a danger in saying I don't see color. It invalidates people's experiences. You can't fix something that you can't see. It limits your ability to appreciate individualism. It minimizes the struggles of people of color in today's society. You're not actively dismantling your own prejudices, and we all have them, most definitely. And it allows you to ignore the complexities of racial issues. So color blindness, or I don't see color, we have to shift away from that if we're committed to being sensitive to racism-based trauma and racism in the country. This is a text message that I'm sharing between myself and a friend. I text the friend because the friend was tweeting, and the friend very colorfully said, you know, I don't want to be identified as a person of color. I said, you know, educate me on this at some point. It doesn't have to be tonight, because I texted her at night. The friend said, I feel like it silences our Black voices. She said, in brown, quote unquote, people opt in when it benefits them. The person said they don't bear the struggle like us, so I can't identify with that group. I said, okay, so I'm trying to learn and educate myself while she's talking about this. I said, okay, erasure, I think I get that. Bandwagoning, I didn't think of that. She said, yeah. And she said, you know, why are they brown and we're Black? I mean, I love being Black, but I'm just saying, I think she was using like connotations of Black being associated with death. But she's educating me, and I think this is something that we can do constantly to educate ourselves. I included this too in the sources here. I got this one from a colleague as well, and this is talking about this idea of colorism. Again, when we're thinking about racism-based trauma and race in this country as a construct, it's highly nuanced, and there's a colorism piece there as well. The friend and my colleague was sort of acknowledging their place as it relates to being a light-skinned person of color. Colorism is a thing, and it often benefits you. There's privilege, but it doesn't cancel out the pain that racism has caused you. But it's encouraging people to recognize their privilege. So again, if you have some time to think about colorism and engage with that construct, give it a chance. And what I will say about this, when I was doing the interviews, there was one participant in New Orleans who mentioned that one of her clients received a lesser sentence. The client had robbed a bank and was an accomplice. So it was a pretty serious offense. And the participant mentioned that she felt that the client got a lesser sentence because the client was a woman and because she was light-skinned. She was trying to tease out this idea that colorism exists and maybe people of a lighter complexion in New Orleans were favored. I'm not from New Orleans, but she was sort of trying to orient me and engage me in this idea. So when we think about educating, it's important to consider the nuances of colorism, to consider the experiences of people of color and Black people in particular, and to push back against this idea of color blindness. So Dr. Francois and I mentioned racial identity development and how these are statuses that are fluid. Nazir, who was my only Black male participant, and again, these are these aren't their real names. I included this side. Nazir says, I've never been trained on that, racism-based trauma. I think it might have come up when we started talking about being culturally competent, because I went to a historically Black college or university. It's HBCU. We always had that conversation about African Americans. We all talked about our experiences growing up. And I'm saying this to you, we've had this conversation. So my social work experience within the classroom setting was different because it was an HBCU. We talked about things you wouldn't talk about at Ole Miss or the University of Mississippi or the predominantly white school. I include this because I think it's a good example of racial identity and the statuses and how they're fluid and how they can change. What I thought was interesting was how Nasir was saying, hey, the conversations can be had here, but it's impossible for them to be had there. And I think that as we mature in our statuses, we should be able, hopefully, to have these conversations everywhere. And for higher education in particular, I think it's crucial for us to have those conversations everywhere. Participants also, and this may be just, this is very social working and it's resilience to the core, but participants mentioned how they still felt comfortable being able to talk about the construct. So Angela and Harriet both said they felt comfortable doing it. They have their clients, they feel like they've been treated a kind of way and they may want to know how they felt about it. Angela said, I feel really comfortable. For context, Angela is a Latina, Afro-Latina woman in New York, in the state of New York. So she's feeling comfortable. Her racial identity, I guess, is sort of affording her this comfortability that some of the other participants didn't have. Now we'll talk about some of the challenges, and there are challenges. As a researcher doing this, I'm still trying to figure out how to challenge and have these conversations in the workplace. And this was the same for a lot of participants. Eliza said she thinks that it's a real challenge to address racism because nobody wants to be called racist. Sarah said culture shifting takes a long time to evolve your thinking. As the social and political climate changes, is not a thing that comes easy. Angela says in the courtroom, the one thing you probably can't say is that the reason the justice system is as it is because of supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. People don't want to hear that. She said it feels like people are going around the elephant in the room. Angela gets at this idea of not all skinfolk being kinfolk. You may not even be at the level where you can hear, you can process it, right? Like, wait, so this whole system is constructed against me because of racism. She's talking about the prison system and things like that. You may not want to hear that, or you might not be on that side of the spectrum. Not all skinfolk are kinfolk, and some don't believe in that blank at all. Harriet says, sometimes people that are not of your same background don't understand. She said, I work with a lot of white people and they don't get it. They never had the experience of being stopped for no reason. They don't understand. We may have a client that says, hey, I was profiled. I wasn't doing anything but driving. And the first thing that some of her colleagues say is that, well, you must have been doing something. They make assumptions pretty quickly. So if I go back and mention that there was a lot of talk about questioning allyship and what that looks like. Some people don't believe in allyship at all, but for those who do, it's important to consider where you fall on this allyship spectrum. Are you a performer or are you authentic? And this is something that should be taken into consideration fairly quickly. So if you're a performative ally, there's bandwagoning that happens. Oh, everyone is putting out a statement about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. We should do something as well. Oh, it's gonna look pleasing if we post something out. The optics are gonna be great if we join in on this. Oh, I feel guilty. There's white fragility at play. There's resentment. Your statement appeared after you were called out. Personally, I've been in some private meetings and suggested that, hey, I think that a certain person should have issued something, and also say that I'm not interested in hearing from it. But there's also virtue signaling and then centering yourself. Or to bring it closer to home, if you're familiar with the group Lady Antebellum, there's a blues singer named Lady A. Lady A, formerly known as Lady Antebellum, filed a lawsuit against blues singer Anita White, who goes by the name Lady A. Jeanette Cordova says they dropped Antebellum in support of Black Lives Matter movement, and now they're suing a Black blues singer who's been going by their new name for years. This is a perfect example of this performative stuff, missing the entire point. Whoa. So they are suing this lady after changing the name in support of Black Lives Matter. So again, optics, bandwagoning, profile management. This is performative sort of at its core. We want to be authentic allies. As a Black man, it's important, and as Black people, I think it's important that, or people of color, that we have allies who are going to be authentic, who are going to empathize, who are going to be grieved, who are going to grieve, outraged. We're going to sit with that discomfort. Oftentimes when I do this presentation, a lot of people choose to take it and run with it immediately. And there are certain things that I just encourage people to do. And one of those is to sit with it and to just think about it. Remembering that it's not about you is important. There's no virtue signaling. It's about taking real action and doing things oftentimes that people may not necessarily hear about. You don't have to post everything. Examining your own privilege and using it to help. Again, educating yourself, letting your brand be of no concern, and taking risks that hold yourself accountable and others accountable. This is about having conversations in your living room just as much as it's about having conversations in the workplace. I have a lot of students, particularly white students, who reached out to me this summer when the George Floyd lynching happened, and the student was trying to figure out how to talk to her family about it. And the student said, I know that I grew up knowing my dad had sheets in his closet. So I'm in Mississippi. The student was referring to, the father being in the Klan. And, it's important that you have those conversations and you take the risk to have those conversations sometimes at home. So the participants identified some beneficial aspects to this approach. Eliza said, I think people have a shot to be treated well at the most basic level of humanity. Maya said, there's a lot that I want to add to my knowledge and understanding. I think that what we're discussing is a huge issue. I feel like I have work to do. We all do. Harriet said, when you're dealing with people that may not have the same racial background as you, a lot of discussion is needed. One thing that offends her the most is when white people feel the need to fix us or fix her. She said, we're not broken people, talking about Black people. Harriet is a Black woman. We're not broken people. We just may not have had the same benefits or the same opportunities as other people. But it doesn't mean that you're smarter. It just means that you have had different opportunities. So thinking about this, again, because there are certain things that I did, and there's certain things that we wanted you to take with you, because I know there's students in here, there are practitioners in here, researchers. Part of this is figuring out where you are in this social change ecosystem and figuring out how to do it quickly. I have conversations as a professor with my school about the upcoming semester, and I'm urging them to think about where we are and where our position is, because students are going to be expecting us to have a position. I think it's incumbent on us to do that, particularly as leaders. And for higher education in particular, I always suggest that there's learning that needs to happen amongst the students, but it's also important that we as faculty members and teachers not push that burden onto them. I have a responsibility to do some things, and I plan to do that. So it's also important to figure out where we fit in this system. As a Black man, watching and seeing and hearing the news was stressful. It was traumatic. So to get texts about, hey, what do I do, was also tiring and dramatic, to the point where I would send this out. So part of what you can do is be a guide, be a weaver, be an experimenter, be a frontline responder, be a storyteller, be a healer, be a disruptor, be a caregiver, be a builder, be a visionary. These are all couched in this diversity and inclusion and equity spectrum and the work that goes into that. But it's important that you sort of figure out your role, particularly for social work practice and education, but in general. What I also want to do, what we wanted to do was sort of offer some resources that could be used and picked up fairly quickly. I included two great authors and researchers. If you remember the young lady that I had in the picture, I know she's currently reading Anti-Racist Baby by Ibram X. Kendi. These are books and texts that you can use and implement in the classroom and in your practice. And if you're committed to learning about anti-racism and racism-based trauma. There's also the Racial Healing Handbook. This is authored by Dr. Annalise Singh. She's also a new member of Tulane School of Social Work and the Tulane community. It's important too to remember strategies and ideas that are currently out there. The work that Dr. Francois and I are doing, it has some newness to it, but we're borrowing and revisiting constructs. One of them is post-traumatic slave syndrome, and there are other theories, assessments, and approaches out there. From our practitioners in particular who are interested in looking at resources that are out there, I suggest that you look at a fairly recent assessment. It's called the UNREST. It's the Yukon Racial, Ethnic Stress, and Trauma Survey. And then if you want to be creative and sort of get your boots on the ground and figure out what people are actually saying, and if you're engaged on social media, track Instagram accounts and hashtags. One that's really helpful and powerful is Black in the Ivory. One word, no spaces. It gives you a way to sort of learn and hear about the stories of Black people, and particularly Black people in education. And then Instagram accounts like Black Women PhDs and other accounts are set up to expose you to Black voices, Black stories, and particularly those of Black women. I do want to say that in my work, in my research, I'm intentional in working with people, but particularly women and Black women, because I have to be sensitive to my intersectional points and realize that as a Black man, there are certain privileges that I have. So it's intentional that I'm engaging with Black women like Dr. Francois, like Dr. Maria Glad, Carolyn Barber Pierre, so on and so forth. So it's important that we look at and engage with different voices and different people, and we amplify that. This is something that we think can be used, again, in the classroom, at home, in practice. And part of the questions may be, okay, how do we assess for this? Where do we even get started in thinking about racism-based trauma and how to assess for it? Some approaches may not be complex, some may be simple. And this is a check-in to do with clients and students, but also to do with yourself. Instead of asking the how are you, Keely Shaw's think how to shift that question. How have you been sleeping? What story are you telling yourself today? What are your top 3 feelings today? What have you done just for you? How can I support you? What lies do you feel yourself believing? What color is your heart today? What thoughts have been circling in your brain? I will say what color is your heart is really, really helpful. When I text fraternity brothers this question, they respond and they'll put an orange heart or a red heart. These mean certain things, but it's impactful. And this is one way to sort of alter your practice and your approach. Another thing that we're suggesting when you think about race and racism in this country is to really orient yourself to race and to racism in the country, to take small bites and to take different bites. Engage with the Tuskegee experiment, the one drop rule. Ruby Bridges just spoke yesterday at Tulane. Think about Claudette Colvin and what her story is about. Cold Noir, the 3/5 Compromise. And for different learners, it may take some time to read different material. The Cooking Gene is a great book because it orients you to culinary history in the Old South. But for New Orleans in particular, for New Orleans students and people who may not be from the community, it's important to understand the community in which you live in which you are contributing to and back to. He does a great job of talking about different recipes. One in particular is gumbo. So realizing the history behind gumbo, what hush puppies are, is very, very impactful. The recipes that we use and enjoy, they have a story to them. And it's just one of the many ways that we can learn and orient ourselves to race and racism in the country. And then lastly, before we open it up for questions and I leave it to Dr. Francois for comments, is, it's important that we educate ourselves and that we educate other people. It has to be at a constant. I'll end my portion of this with a great tweet by this gentleman named Bilal. He says, stop commending people for being resilient and strong, and instead redesign the systems that inherently make people suffer. So it's important that we consider what race and what racism-based trauma is, and then try to figure out ways to push back against the systems that have even made that possible. Dr. Francois, any comments?
No closing comments. Thank you, Dr. Davis, because I want to make sure we have enough time to get to the questions we have in the Q&A. There's some really, really good questions in there.
Okay, great. So I'm going to stop sharing it because I want to open up the questions and see it and figure out how to work this. Okay. All right, great. Yeah, we will share the slides. Will I come back? Yeah, sure. Dr. Francois, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I see in the Q&A, the first question I'm happy to take is racism-based trauma similar to intergenerational trauma? And I think that it absolutely is. My understanding, intergenerational trauma is not sort of a form of trauma that I've done a lot of study in, but my understanding of intergenerational trauma are those sort of experiences or events that can happen to individuals or a family, say for example, and that trauma sort of manifests in both kind of a nature and nurture way, and then it can get passed down to the generations that follow them. So I think, sort of experiences of racism and racist events can certainly be, and certainly are, transmitted intergenerationally, but there are definitely other forms of trauma that have that intergenerational piece as well. So to briefly answer that question, I think yes, I think it is a intergenerational trauma can also be based in racism. I'm happy to address the next question as well. Actually, I actually want to address the next two.
Sure, go ahead.
That I see in the Q&A. And I'm going to say Iriti, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and I think I know you too. She's asking actually both of us, Dr. Davis. I'm wondering if there's a conception of social stratification between people that experience collective trauma from the state, beyond a racism conception, but more towards a social subjugation perspective, inclusive of gender, sexuality, or otherwise marginalized group identity status. I imagine this could recognize a pattern of trauma accumulation outside of your immediate group membership to membership of a broader subjugated group. Thank you for that question. That's a really, really good question. And I think for me, it makes me lean to, kind of the construct and concept that Kimberly Crenshaw, presented to us, that of intersectionality. So for example, I might have an experience at work and I have these intersecting identities that I name for myself that are about my racial group, my gender group, my sexual orientation, and so on. And when I have this experience, do I know if is it because of my that racial identity group I identify with? Is it because of the gender identity group I identify with? And in an intersectional way, I don't think we at an individual level really always tease those things out. And I don't think we have to. I think we can, my read of Eriti's question is that it could be about and I think this is the identity piece that we spoke to, sort of our integrated identities that put us in sort of this larger group of, oppressed, subjugated, marginalized folks, right? So I do, if I'm understanding your question, Eriti, and I hope I am answering it, I do think there is, I wouldn't say beyond racism, but it like these intersecting identities cause sort of this intersected experience of an incident. Dr. Davis, you want to respond to that as well?
I was thinking about Kimberly Crenshaw as well, and I'm glad you brought that up. So thank you.
Another question I'll take, and then I'm going to stop, Dr. Davis, and you can take charge. From Monica Stevens, a concern for me working with children who have other forms of trauma is adding extra stress by proactively bringing these topics up. And the speaker's comment on considerations for broaching the subject with Black children in a way that respects the space they need to process these issues. So I really like this question, Monica. One, because I'm a developmental psychologist by training. So, you know, the developmental piece of these phenomena that we're talking about is really at the forefront of my own research. So I have two thoughts in response to your question, Monica. One, I do think that in the position that, you know, be you a social worker, counselor, psychologist, educator, whatever your role is in interacting with children who identify as Black or as African American, is that whatever experiences of trauma they may be presenting with, or that is their sort of presenting issue, there is often the possibility that different forms of racism are wrapped up into those traumas as well. So it's not the sort of thing that I wouldn't think of it as this separate type of trauma over here, because again, you know, when we couch racism-based trauma in that term, we're couching it in understanding racism as this thing that is across our existence, right? So it's systematic, it's cultural, it's institutional. So it's gonna sort of create, you know, economic situations that can you know, present or rather promote a situation where a child is at risk for certain types of trauma in their home life, in their neighborhood, in their schools. So I would think of, you know, that, you know, for those particular children, that piece of the potential for racism-based trauma is probably a part of these other traumatic experiences or events that they might be presenting with. At the same time, again, I think it's important to have an approach in these professions when working with not just Black children, but all populations of different racial and ethnic groups, that they are the experts in their own experiences, and let them identify for you what they think the source of it is, or what they think it's about, and then move forward from there. I want to stop talking because I don't want to talk too much and give it to you, Dr. Davis.
Great, Dr. Francois. Yeah, definitely. Jamie Ingram, I see your comment. Would love to discuss the Lady A switch. Yeah, that's a crazy one. You can follow that one too. Alex Lopez, thank you for your energy. I'm wondering about how you came up with the questions you asked the people who participated in your study. Did you find an interview guide that you used as a model and adapted? I'd love to hear about your process with prioritizing what kinds of questions to ask and how you decided on question wording. Thanks again. Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Alex. So this study started probably late 2017, early 2018. This is part of dissertation work. So a couple of things happened. I looked at similar studies thinking about race and the experiences of racism. And a lot of the questions were, they were always intended to be pretty simple and pretty straightforward, because this was supposed to be a baseline study in one where I just looked at the construct to figure out what social workers knew about it, because there was nothing out there specifically for social work pedagogy or practice. And then honestly, this isn't a fun answer, but the other part is that the questions that I had, once I submitted this to the Institutional Review Board for review, they kind of said, no, you should ask the question this way, because they were sensitive to questions sort of putting people under duress, because this was kind of serious. There were some participants who cried, who were wondering if they had perpetuated racism or racism-based trauma. So it was a combination of looking at previous studies, talking to my colleagues in committee, and then also the IRB sort of saying, no, you shouldn't ask this, or you should change this question. So I hope that helps, and we can talk about that more later on. Okay, cool. Okay, Janiska, I see your question. Do you have any recommendations, references that help explain these concepts to children? Oh, yeah, Dr. Francois.
I am starting to curate such a list that I am happy to share and make available to all attendees. Because, you know, as one might guess or imagine, because, you know, the country has woken up to the fact that we have a problem with racism, there's a lot of, there's a lot of communications and resources going around. So Janeska, I'm happy, and others who, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name, Janishka, happy to share this list that it's not a final list, but happy to share it.
Mm-hmm. Sure. This is from Loren. There's an ongoing societal conversation regarding the relationship between African Americans and Jewish people. As of late, an African American celebrity was interviewed espousing theories related to Jewish people, descent, and success in America. I'm not here to, I got you. My question is, do you all think the response from many African Americans as it relates to Jewish people is steeped in collective racial trauma?
So I have a thought on that question. I think I think it can be connected to the collective racial trauma of African Americans in a sense that, and this is not my area of expertise, but in a sense that people of Jewish culture in this country in particular have been awarded the privilege of whiteness. So I think it may be linked to, Jewish people being able to have that white privilege and the experiences of privilege related to whiteness, more so than their Jewishness, if you will. So, that's as much as I think I can say based on my very limited engagement with this particular question and topic that it relates to.
Yeah, it's a great question too, Loren, and I'm thinking about it. I'm familiar with what happened with this person and what this person said, and it's a sentiment that a lot of people echo a lot. And there are certain parts that are controversial. They definitely spark a lot of controversy, and I want to spend more time thinking about how to approach it and talk about it. And one thing that this person made me think about, and it's separate from this, is, and I forgot to mention it during the presentation, in our country, one thing that I've noticed is that when we think about race, we think about it as a duality of black and white. But if we're thinking about racism-based trauma as a whole, we should think about the experiences of everyone in different races, ethnicities, and so on and so forth. It's nuanced and it's difficult, and I appreciate that question. Okay, from Lori. From what you've seen on the university level, what changes will take place to welcome and support social work students of color not at HBCUs? There are large performative stances taken, but what meaningful approaches will have the most long-lasting effect? Laura, I have no idea, honestly. I can speak for me personally and in my experiences and right now what I'm doing. And this comes from the work, again, with working with some great people like Dr. Francois or Carolyn Barber Pierre, Sienna Abdullahad at Tulane University. I'm familiar with diversity, equity, and inclusion and that spectrum and the work that goes into it. What has happened at my school is that I'm chairing a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee because there are a lot of students who are experiencing a lot of things and it's coming out. And no one was really stepping up to do anything. So I'm doing this work. And one of the things that I'm pushing for, and it's ambitious, and for those who are familiar with the academy know how difficult this is, I want tenure expectations for faculty to change. What's come up in conversations is that a lot of Black faculty and faculty of color, particularly Black women, have engaged in this thing called other mothering, or taking on roles of a mother or fictive kin, and they can't do their research. They can't do they're teaching, but they're really helping these students, particularly Black students, and not getting any credit for it. So my hope is that universities will shift how they talk about this and how they incentivize or reward people. I got this great thing from Sian Abdullah. She shared it. It's San Diego State University's 10-point diversity and inclusion plan. But if you want to read it, there's a lot in there, but it talks about engaging in placemaking exercises where more students of color see their faces on campus. At the University of Southern Mississippi, it's pretty sterile, so I'm hoping that these things will change. Dr. Francois, what are you thinking? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think what you've mentioned is right on target. You know, when I first read that question, I was like, have I come across any examples of institutions that are really sort of doing, you know, practicing that authentic allyship your slide covered, right? Because I really think that's where it starts, is that, you know, there has to be, for the power holders in our institutions, you know, our presidents, our provosts, our deans, I think they really sort of need to start with kind of that self-evaluation and self-examination at the same time that, you know, they shift, you know, the university culture that in a way that creates a greater sense of belonging among its students, faculty, and staff. It's non-white students, faculty, and staff. You know, in our institutions, there has been, you know, and there's a history behind this push to diversity. But that the diversity just gets you in the room. It just gets you in the building. It just gets you, but that doesn't mean you belong or you're accepted or you're included. And your experiences and your ways of knowing. So, and that's the culture shift that needs to happen. And I wanted to, you know, be able to offer up some examples, but I don't know of any. But I do think that's a part of that's where the work needs to start for us to get there.
Yeah, I'm looking in the chat as well.
I was just gonna say there are 3 questions that are in the chat, and I just didn't want them to get lost. If it's convenient, I can read them out for you just because I have them kind of placeholded here. So the first was a participant asked, can you speak some more about how the term POC or person of color can silence Black voices?
Dr. Francois, you want to go or you want me to?
So I can go quickly. The challenge or the ways in which I think it can silence Black voices is because it can make them invisible when they're being lumped with whomever else is considered a person of color, right? Yes, there are, you know, systemic experiences or shared experiences of systemic oppression that Black folk in this country, that Indigenous folk in this country, that Latinx folk in this country experience. But, and obviously that's not an exhaustive list, but there are very unique and particular experiences that each of those groups have had in this country that needs to be recognized and acknowledged and dealt with as we start to try to shift to, you know, an anti-racist society. And I think that's why that terminology of person of color or POC has become problematic or is problematic for folks.
Yeah. Dr. Oldham is answering these questions as well. And Dr. Martin King spoke about the Negroes, the only ethnic minority who did not get a fair share of resources when arriving here involuntarily, while other European peasants were given millions of acres. So also, if you go back and there's so much literature out there. One that I enjoy reading is from Anna Julia Cooper. African-American woman, a Black woman, and she says, you know, the African-American race is the only race where when the Black woman enters the room, the rest of the race enters with her. This is when I was engaged in like Black feminist theory, but she's mentioning how things are just very, very unique and specific for Black people and for African Americans. And it goes back to the text conversation that I had with a friend as well of, hey, there's this occurrence, the occurrences are happening where people of color who aren't Black are sort of picking up and bandwagoning or performing to sort of get the benefits or some of the clout and then leaving, or who may also be perpetuating some of the racist acts themselves. So I hope that answers that, Natasha. Thank you.
There's another question in the chat. It got lost a little bit a way ago, but it reads, thank you for this presentation. This was amazing. I've been teaching social justice practice at the MSW level, and I would love to know if you have any recommendations regarding resources for my micro-oriented students on how to continue to call in coworkers and other partners that they interact with.
Yeah, I think the ones in the PowerPoint may be pretty helpful. I think trainings are a way to complement that too. And if you're at the university, if you're at the university, and we're finding out that this is not the case for everyone, but Tulane I was fortunate enough to be affiliated with the Office of Multicultural Affairs. It's now the Center for Intercultural, Carolyn Barber Pierre Center for Intercultural Life. There were a lot of student community engaged advocates and other resources where we could partner with, because one thing that I don't want to do is make this a burden on everyone. And we want to make sure that everyone is sort of doing the work, but there are resources that I can share, and then we can share. Dr. Francois? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that, yeah.
Sure. I think there may have been one more, Leah. Did you see that one?
Yes, I do have one more from the chat.
Okay.
It reads, can you talk about, quote, black on black, unquote, crime as a misnomer on race? What is crime called when a white kills a white or an Asian kills an Asian? It's just terrible. The social construct is really destroying humanity.
I'll be brief, and Dr. Prince, I'll let you do it. Yeah, it is a misnomer. It's a covert technique, in my opinion, of framing, and it's similar to after the storm, after Katrina. You can look it up. There are two articles. One, they're both of people just sort of trying to get supplies from stores. And the news, when there were two Black people waiting in the water trying to get supplies, they were described as looters. But when I think it's a white man and a white woman were trying to get supplies, it was framed as, hey, these people are trying to survive and get supplies. So it's a tactic used by the media to sort of shift focus, and it is one of these covert things that we're talking about. And then, you will often hear people say, and I agree with this, that black on black crime as a message is a myth. That's not true. So, Dr. Francois.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add.
Got you. So this is, I'm going through the question and answers, and I see a question from Curtis Davis, and I'm like, I didn't answer the question, but I'm realizing this is my dad. So
I thought that was you, and I skipped over it. That did confuse me.
It's my dad. Cool. All right. With the state of current events, is it possible that there could be a delayed increase in trauma from those who may have been unknowingly affected? Man, most definitely. Yeah, most definitely. I think that's why it's important that we're proactive in our consideration of this. And two, the question about children and how we talk to them is so important, because their digestion and intake of information is so different and so greater than I think ours, like generation. Like, they're seeing my younger cousin post on Instagram, and he's like 12, Black Lives Matter and things like that. It's just so different. He is exposed to millions upon millions of images and millions of different like content. So I think so. I think so. And then I think, Pop, I won't tell your age, but I think for you, this is something that's new, where you have to go back and jog your memory and think about what happened at 20, 25, 30, 14, 15. You're like, wow, that was that, and I didn't realize it. So, Dr. Francois, anything?
Yeah, and I actually want to kind of take Mr. Davis's question along with the next question that follows from Leah Rosen Pritchard, who asked, would institutional betrayal compound racism-based trauma, and is it relevant as part of the framework or lens we look through? So my response to sort of both of those questions is that, kind of going back to what I said toward the beginning of the presentation, is an incident or an event does not become a trauma or traumatic, and this is according to some theorists, until we conceptualize it as such, until we acknowledge it as such. And that can happen on the individual level, it can happen on a collective level. And in that collective way, you know, like we're talking about racism-based trauma as having both this individual and collective component. In a collective way, it's about that shared group, be it like Dr. Davis's nephew, you know, young Black children, or Black teenagers, or any other group, or you know, recent immigrants into the country. As that group is grappling with the goings on, or whatever is going on, what they're experiencing, what they're being exposed to, it's both done consciously and subconsciously that they start to shape it into, this was really messed up. This did us harm. We were harmed by this. This was hurtful. So now it's becoming shaped and formed as a trauma, and also potentially being, working itself into a part of that collective identity, and how sort of they move forward with, you know, how do we get redress for this trauma? So I think, yes, I'd absolutely think, to Mr. Davis's question, that there could be sort of this delay, if you will, as, you know, particularly for young children. And, you know, I have a 9-year-old son, you know, they're, as Dr. Davis said, their processing, their cognitive processing and intellectual processing is at a different stage, but they're still processing these experiences in reality. And they're going to come to a knowledge and understanding, when they do, about what it was and what it meant and what it said about them and the collective that they identify with. And I think the same thing in response to Leah's question, I do think the framework works in the context of kind of these institutional betrayals. And I love that, because I think those betrayals, those incidents, those maneuverings are not new. I think they sort of, you know, they are kind of reformulations of the ways in which institutions and systems have always oppressed and marginalized the people and the groups that it's always oppressed and marginalized. And the people, you know, at the receiving end of that, I think they, you know, it does get conceptualized as such.
Most definitely. Zachary Ransom, where did you say you did the study? Who was the RB affiliated with, and how much influence did they actually put on the questions you asked? Were there any particular points of contention? All right, so I did the study at Tulane. The reviewers were surprisingly generous. I was just surprised at them paying attention to how, hey, these are questions about race. Make sure you don't put anyone under duress, and being mindful of that. There wasn't a terrible amount of influence on the questions. What did happen, were there any particular points of contention? I'll be honest with you, Zachary, and this is something that I don't mind sharing, and this is an honest conversation that we're having, and it paints the reality. I got some pushback and contention from certain professors in the program, which was surprising. There was a bit of hesitancy around the questions that I wanted to ask. Dr. Francois was on my committee. So obviously there was no pushback there, but from other people and people in position of power, there was a little bit of contention. So I think with this sort of work, and when you have these questions, people want to know, what are you doing? And beyond that, I think people want to know, what pot are you about to stir? What's about to happen? There's this hesitancy or this fearfulness. So yeah. Cicely Campbell says, will the presentation be available afterwards? Sure, most definitely. I wasn't familiar with Dr. William Smith's work and Dr. Edwin Nichols' work, but I am now, and I'm going to look it up.
Yes, I'm not either, but they're on my list. Racial battle fatigue, man, I can't wait to read about that. So yes, Cicely, thank you for those references, and if you want to share them with us, please do. But yes, and we will make the presentation available, a version of the presentation available when we send along the evaluation as well. I know Dr. Davis has some data in the presentation that, that he may not want to make publicly available. But in terms of sort of, I think the resources, and I think that's what folks are maybe wanting from it, they'll definitely be available. We'll definitely make those available.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. I think we may have cleared all of those questions, which is incredible.
Wow.
We don't normally actually make it all the way through the question list, but thank you also both for everyone who's still on the call with us, for staying a bit over time so that we could get through those questions and hear all of your responses. So again, for folks who are still logged on, please keep an eye out for the evaluation form that'll be coming to you via email. And graciously, Dr. Davis and Dr. Francois are going to share a version of the PowerPoints as well. So that will also be coming to your email. And I just wanted to take the time to just really thank you both so much for taking the time to share your work with all of us, and to even go overtime to make sure all of our questions got answered. Thank you both so much. It's been a real honor to have you with us today. And thank you everyone for joining in, and for taking the time out of your day to join us for this conversation.
Yeah. Hey, Leah.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, Leah, can you hear me?
Yep.
I want to do a quick plug, especially after there are a lot of Tulane people on the call. If you're interested in furthering the efforts of the Carolyn Barber Pierre Center for Intercultural Life, please think about contributing to them. They're doing a lot of great work, things around combating food insecurity on campus and diversity and inclusion education. It's a center that nurtured me as a graduate student, but it nurtures a lot of people, particularly students of color that come through Tulane. So if you're interested in contributing and getting some resources, definitely think about doing that. This is just specific for Tulane folks and for anyone. So thank you, Leah, for that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Sure. Good deal.
Yeah.